welcome to another exciting episode of The Energy That Surrounds Us. I'm your host, Michael, and tonight's episode is pre-recorded due to scheduling between the guest and myself, so I hope you all will be enjoying this episode. And if you do leave any comments in the chat room during the live show, we will be checking and we will respond as soon as we see them. But just a reminder, due to it being a pre-recorded show, I will not be able to put your comments and questions up on the screen, but do rest assured we will address them. And with all that lovely housekeeping now out of the way, I am proud, blessed, and so grateful to be able to introduce you all to a guest who I think is going to totally rethink your brain. And I'm not even sure how that came out of my mouth because I don't even know what that means myself, but we'll find out. And so without further ado, I give you the one, the only, the amazing Rob Sullivan.
Michael, thank you for having me on your show. And I appreciate you accommodating the time difference. I'm in London right now. So, obviously we're a long time apart time-wise. So it's nice to be able to pre-record. And thank you for everybody who's tuning in and watching.
So for those who may be sitting there, watching this episode, how would you describe who you are and what A Trek Within is about?
So who I am and what this is all about, this is literally something that picked me. I didn't really pick it. And so let me tell you what I mean by that. Over the last 10 years, I've been working on my book, A Trek Within, Embracing Unexpected Truths. And I never expected it to take so long because I had written a book before that on job search. I wrote it fairly quickly, edited it a few times and put it out. This one took a lot longer. And the reason it took a lot longer was because partly there were experiences that I needed to have that I hadn't yet had. But the whole thing is all about things that I was not raised to believe, but that I've come to embrace. And so each chapter covers a variety of different topics. So, we've got past lives, dreams, intuition, alternative medicine, all kinds of different things that, I was raised Catholic, so it was relatively conservative and fairly traditional upbringing in that regard. And, take past lives as an example. That isn't something that the church necessarily embraces now. And when I say now, I'm not a historian by any stretch, but my understanding is there was a time over 1,000 years ago or around that where the church did accept things like past lives. And if I believe it was the Council of Nicaea, if I'm not mistaken, where they went through and systematically removed all of the references to past lives. They did, however, miss a number of them. And so if anybody who has read the Bible will know there's, passages where they refer to, different things where they say, are you this person? Are you that person? And the reason they're asking those questions is because, they accepted at that time the idea that we reincarnate. When I was little and I first heard about that, I remember I had heard a George Harrison song and the lyrics, were where he talks about, keep me free from birth. And I remember asking, I think it was my dad, what did that mean? And he was explaining to me like the caste system and what people believe about reincarnation. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't like that idea. But over time, I embraced it because I realized that there's a lot of validity to that. And there were some experiences that I had along the way that demonstrated to me that, yeah, in fact, that happens. And then later I had some additional experiences that made me think that, yeah, I've had it. And I can identify some of the past lives that I've had and what were the common threads. So there was, that's just one example. So that's, when I wrote the book, I didn't do it. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm not trying to start a new religion. I'm not going to miss a meal if you don't buy it or you're not into it. It's just something that it's enriched my life in so many ways that I really felt like I need to talk about this. And one of the reasons that I, was moved to do it, and this is going to sound sort of odd, but when you look at like the spiritual category or new age or whatever you want to call it, there are not that many male authors in the category. And the ones that are, almost down to the last one, are psychologists. And there's nothing wrong with that, other than the fact that that's, got its own particular brand of crazy. But my background's not that at all. I'm more of a business background. I started out in advertising, working at Leo Burnett in Chicago. I worked on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade as an options trader. I've done, I'm more from a business traditional background. I'm not like woo-woo spiritual, sort of person, but the things that I've experienced have really opened my eyes to that, and it's enriched my life in a million different ways.
Wow, that's really amazing. And I find it interesting, and I'm curious your thoughts of, do you feel that the intuition is affected by not only information that comes through as the subconscious interacts with the conscious and dreams, but past lives as well? Could the past lives have an influence on your intuition abilities?
I definitely think so. And it's not just, and I wouldn't limit it to my intuition. And so here, let me explain what I mean by that. A number of years ago, I had a session with a woman in Chicago named Therese Rowley, and Therese is really gifted. She's not a typical, psychic, and she'll laugh. And so, although she can tune in, to people who passed on, she jokingly says, I'm not your phone line to the dead. That's not my whole thing. She's more about just helping people tune in and heal and figure out, what's going on. Now, when I had the session with her, I didn't tell her what my objective was. I'll tell you what my objective was. My objective in that session was that I wanted to find out. I've had this feeling intuitively that something was getting in the way of my success, because I had written a book, and the reviews had been great, and but it was just not gaining traction. There were things that were happening, like, for example, it was a book on job search. It was called "Getting Your Foot in the Door When You Don't Have a Leg to Stand On." And there were, fairly quickly 7 or 8 schools that started using it as a textbook. And they were using, and one of the schools wrote me a letter and said, we used to use What Color Is Your Parachute, which is the top selling book in that category. And they said, our teachers and our students like your book better, and we just want to thank you for that. And so I forwarded that on to McGraw-Hill, the publisher, and their response was, yeah, we don't really care. We don't see it as a textbook. And as a marketing person, because my background, as I said, was in advertising, I was horrified. I'm like, how could you, if I'm running a company and I find out that I've got a book that is outselling, or doing better and, more favorably reviewed than the best book in the category, I'd be inclined to support that and do some marketing behind it. They didn't do anything. So long story short, the book went through 4 printings, but it really didn't get anywhere, and it never gained, momentum in any meaningful way. And I really felt like I was stuck. So that was why I was going to Therese, because I wanted to figure out what is happening here. And so she starts, looking in and doing her thing. And she's got a very different approach. So she'll, these were face-to-face meetings. She's on the opposite side of the room. She shuts her eyes and she starts, like, she can see energy, and she moves it around by, snapping her fingers and blowing and doing this and that. Really fun to watch. But she started looking at, sort of tuning into me. And she said one of the first things out of her mouth, after she described me doing something that it was like spinning your wheels, which is like, yeah, that's exactly what I feel like. And then she said, let me tune in a little bit more. And she looks in and she said, you have the most elaborate system of stuffing your feelings that I've ever seen. And she said, it's really beautiful what you've created, but I don't get that it's helping you. And she said, do I have your permission to look in and, learn, try to figure out where it's coming from? I said, absolutely. So she said, say your name 3 times and we'll tune in. So she starts tuning in, and she gets this, as she's looking and, doing the moving the energy around thing, she's like, oh, oh, and I'm like, what? What are you seeing? And she looks at me and she said, you had a past life in a fascist regime. I'm not going to say which one it was. She told me which one it was. She said, you were a soldier. And she said, you did not want to be a soldier. She said, but your family expected it. Your country expected it. You didn't really have another choice. And because you knew that you were going to get killed if you didn't do that. And all the men in your country were, the young men, that's what they were doing at that point. So she said, you became a soldier. And she said, but you didn't, because you didn't want to do it. Your way of dealing with that was to say, all right, I'm just going to follow orders. I'm going to do what I'm told. And that's it. She said, the problem was you did a really good job of following orders. So you got promoted. And as you got promoted, you became more and more responsible for what was happening. So she said, when you finished that lifetime, you looked back and you said, never again. You said, I'm going to spend the rest of my lifetimes in service of humanity with no expectation of earthly reward. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, well, that would certainly explain why I'm, circling the drain financially and not really getting anywhere. And it was interesting because then she tunes in and she's like, we need to figure out if this was a vow that you made or whether it was an agreement. And she said, the difference is if it's an agreement, she said, I can clear it. If it's a vow, you need to do it. Now, to her credit, there's a lot of charlatans out there who will, that's the moment they'd look at you and say, okay, well, you're going to need to buy candles and you're going to need to come and see me every week for, and all this nonsense to, try to get extra money out of you. Therese doesn't do any of that. Therese is all about, hey, you're here. Let's clear it out. It's not going to take that long. So she walks me through a little 10-minute thing. We clear the energy and release that vow and, move on. So I thought, okay, fair enough. Now, a couple of things that are worth pointing out. First of all, my dad was in the Air Force. He loved the Air Force. Even on his deathbed, when he had a moment where he was, he wasn't sure exactly where he was. He asked my mom really excitedly, he said, am I back on active duty? He loved it. He was a flight surgeon. He got to fly in the B-52s and all that. I was born on an Air Force base, but I remember being 16, 17 years old and being afraid that there would be a draft because I knew I had no interest in it. I was terrified of the idea of going into the Army or anything like that.
Same with me.
Yeah. And so but I didn't really know where it was coming from. And there were other things, like take another little, you might call it a synchronicity or a signpost on my journey. But as I was learning how to play guitar, one of the very first songs I learned how to play was a song called The Ballad of Joseph Schultz, which is written by this amazing songwriter named Dave Crossland. And now he taught me how to play it because I had seen him play it at the very first house concert I ever attended. And then later I met up with him at the songwriting workshop and he sat me down and showed me the chords and taught me how to play this song. One of the very first songs I ever learned how to play. It is the most intense song. And it's about a German soldier who, didn't, he signed up, but realized pretty quickly that he didn't want any part of it. And so there were all these, little things. Now this happened, that song, learning that song on guitar happened before my session with Therese. The thing, knowing that I didn't want to be in the military happened before my session with Therese. She had no way of knowing any of those things. Yet here's this, past life that she's pulling up that really ties a lot of that together. Why I was so touched by the song, why I really wanted to learn how to play it, the fact that I was afraid of getting into the military and all that. And by the way, there's no judgment. I mean, I have a lot of respect for the people in our armed forces. I just knew that for me, it was not the right thing. So what happened a week later after that session with Therese, I happened to be at an event where Therese, was there. And the night before I had this, I'm going to call it a vision. I was asleep. So technically it was a dream, but it wasn't really a dream. And I'll explain why. So the way that it happened, it was a Friday night and I was waiting to see if my friend Dean was going to come over because he'd gone to some soccer game and he's like, we had talked about maybe going out, but at 10 o'clock, I realized, what, I'm wiped. I really don't feel like going out. And so I shut the door to it wasn't really a patio. It was like one of those things where it opens up and it looks like a patio, but there's, I think they call them like French doors or whatever. Or a French patio. So I shut the door to that, which is right off my living room. And then I went upstairs, go to sleep. I wake up at 12:10, which from a numerology perspective, I'm told has some significance. I forget if it's like endings or new beginnings or something like that, but there was a significance to that time. But when I woke up, what I had just experienced was this vision where I was back in the dream. We'll call it a dream for now. I was back on my sofa where I was sitting right before I decided to go to bed. And unlike a dream where my house would change and look different, dreams are weird, how it's familiar but not. It was my house. There was nothing different about it. In fact, and it was the same night. Usually, there's no sort of time that you can attach to a dream, but or at least for me, in this moment, I knew it was that same Friday night, and it was earlier, and it was before I had made the decision to shut the patio door. And so I hear, there was this rain happening outside, which actually didn't happen in real life, although they had predicted it. But I heard a sound outside and somebody was trying to get in, and there was this urgency. And so I'm thinking that it's Dean, my buddy, who had decided to come over. So I go downstairs and open the door, and this being rushes at me. I mean, it was just like came right in. And the next thing I know, I'm back, because you had to go downstairs to the front door. And now I'm back up I'm standing at the top of the stairs that are just off the kitchen that go into the living room. And across the room, right by that patio door, is this being. And he's wearing this long trench coat. He's got a top hat. Later, when I saw him outside, he actually looked like Dick Tracy, which is a weird image for me to have because I was never really into cartoons or anything like that. But the square jaw and everything, that was what I was seeing. This is the very first time I had ever had a situation where the communication in the dream was telepathic. And so this being is across the room from me, and telepathically he communicates. He said, "I am that part of you responsible for stuffing your feelings. You can't let me go." And I was like, wow, I get a chill even just telling you that part of it. But so I start thinking really fast because I'm like, all right, where do I go with this? Because here's this being that needs to be acknowledged and is, realizing that I'm kicking him to the curb, basically. And so I looked at him and I paused and I said, "Thank you." I said, "You were there for me at a time where I really needed you." And I was thinking back to what I'd heard about the past life, and stuffing my feelings and, just doing what I was told to do. And I said, "You helped me out." He was probably the one. I never really thought about it like this, but he was probably the one who helped me create that beautiful, elaborate system of stuffing my feelings. I said, "Thank you. You were there when I needed you. I do not need you anymore. It's time for you to go." And I turned around to make it crystal clear. There is no discussion here. We're done. Thank you and goodbye. And so the next thing I know, I see him outside, and and I'm standing at the door. He's standing outside, and this little brown dog comes and leads him away. Now, when I saw Therese at the session, it was an event. I was telling her this, and there was this other woman who knew about Therese's work and was really intrigued. When I came up to her, I said, "Therese, I got to tell you about this dream." And this woman looked at the two of us. She's like, "Can I listen?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure, no problem. I'm an open book. I don't care." So I looked at Teresa and I said, "I understand everything in the dream. I mean, it was crystal clear, except the dog." I said, "I don't get the dog." And Teresa's like, "Yeah, I don't really either." But then this woman looked at us and she said, "Oh, I know what the dog's all about." We looked at her like, "You do?" She said, "Yeah." She said, "When you, had this being there, and you made it clear that you weren't going to be the host, he needed to be led away by something because he didn't have a host. And a dog represents unconditional love. So it was a dog that came to lead him away." And I even just got a chill saying that part. And Teresa and I looked at each other and we were like, "Yeah, that makes perfect sense." That was what it was. Now, I would love, Michael, to look at you and say, "I'm this brilliant business person and I made these changes and then, things started picking up and look what happened." And wow, I didn't do anything different. I kept doing the things that I was doing, before the session with Therese. But I will tell you, it was around that time that things really started to pick up. And I went from a situation where I had a ton of debt and I wasn't doing that well financially to now, I mean, people look at me and they're like, "How do you travel so much? How do you take so much time off?" Things really turned around. And I am absolutely convinced that it was tuning into that past life, uncovering that, realizing that there was that vow that I had made, that I would serve humanity and not get any earthly reward for it. It was in forgiving myself and letting that go that things really started to turn around. And you could, again, not trying to convince anybody of anything, but that was one of the past lives that I uncovered in situations like that, where it really did help me understand what was happening in the moment. So something I'm super grateful for sure.
Right. And what's interesting is doing work myself on past lives and other patterns in my life. One of the things that I found interesting, and I'm glad you touched on, was when you have an element to with what's going on and going, okay, this element is an aspect of me. It was created for me, possibly by me. You know, who's to say where it was created or why, but irregardless, it's there. You gave it purpose, and you thanked it for helping you at the time and made it clear that time is no longer, we're in a different time now. So it's time for it as well to move on. I have gone through that. And what amazes me is the verbiage. Like when you said, thank you for helping me, that was actually, I believe, the verbiage they told me to even say to it. So it was like when you said that, I got chills and was like, oh my gosh, I've done that. I've said those exact words, and it does make a change. Not like you were saying, it's not like physical where like people are like walking up to you now and going, hey, now that you're not doing this, can you do this? It's more of like an energetic wave that went out, and the universe was like, okay, this pattern's over. We now have this void. We need to fill it up. Here's the positive results. Here's the positive energy, and we'll go on. And it's done in such a way that, to me, what amazes me is most of the time I don't even notice it. People will come up to me and say, oh wow, I'm so impressed you're now at this level doing this. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. Wow, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I love that. I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, but that I probably created it. Yeah, because I hadn't really put it this way. I never gave it a lot of conscious thought. I think obviously I knew that's probably what happened, but I just never really thought about it. But I like where you're going with that is that here's something. Here was a creation of ours. In this case, mine, and and that's the thing. I don't think as human beings we do a particularly good job of acknowledging each other. When I teach sales training and stuff, helping people with acknowledgement is a huge thing, because there's so many times, even just in regular everyday conversation, where if we only acknowledge the other person and let them know that we heard them, let them know that we were genuinely interested in their perspective or whatever, we'd have a much easier time. But instead, we jump in and we ask questions and we get confrontational and we do all this stuff. And that, the power of acknowledgement, it really does have a way of letting people just drop their guard for a second and realize that they are interacting with somebody who cares and someone who's paying attention. And we just, we often just discard things that we don't need. And in the image, I don't know why this has popped in my head about 3 times now that we've been having this conversation, but a really weird example of this is, think about pigeons. And you're probably like, where is he going with this? But give me a second. A long time ago, carrier pigeons, we used them, and, worked with them and trained them. And they were very instrumental in carrying messages back and forth and doing all that kind of stuff. Well, look what happens. Technology comes along and we don't need them anymore. And what do? We just basically cast them off. And you hear people talk about, they refer to them as rats with wings and all kinds of stuff. And, I'm not saying that they're the most attractive bird ever, but there's no acknowledgement of, the reason that they hang around people and that they trust people is because that's how they were wired. Because for years we had a great relationship with them, and now we don't need them and we don't care. It's just like we just discard it and we don't do anything. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I had just discarded that entity and didn't acknowledge him for what he had done. He'd probably still be hounding me, and rightly so.
Right. And, it's beautiful that you point out the carrier pigeons because being a history major, they were used in medieval times, in the Middle Ages to World War One. They were instrumental. And like you're saying, technology came along and the carrier pigeon was just tossed aside and was just left. And after all these centuries of being trained to do one thing, it's like, how do you then say to it, okay, go back to your natural instincts? It's like, what are my natural instincts? So that's a great point. And, further your example of, yeah, when we're trained ourselves to do and respond to things, that when something comes along and we're like, oh yeah, so this cell phone's better than that one. Okay, well, chunk it, use the new one. And you're like, well, I don't have this aspect anymore. Well, I'll just adapt. It's like, we shouldn't have to be just adapting. We should be able to go, okay, yeah, so this is no longer serving us. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for all the communication you provided and made possible, and all the data you stored. And to the new device, thank you for agreeing to take this on and what you can now offer me. And I think that's where, when we talk about the awakening, I think that's kind of metaphorically where we're going. Is our old systems were saying, you served us in this point, we're now at this point, and you can grow with me, or you can part ways here, and I bless you, thank you, and wish you well. I'm going this way.
Yeah, and it's just let something come to its full circle and completion, and then move on and be ready. Embrace the next challenge or opportunity, but don't throw something aside, whether it's a person or an experience or whatever. And fail to acknowledge what role it's played. You take, everything plays a role. I think when you look at. Uh, and that's one of the things that I noticed as I was working on the book was that even the what took the book so long was the last chapter was all about my journey with lymphoma, and which was something on my 48th birthday I was diagnosed with tumors. They found a 5 by 7 by 8 centimeter tumor sitting on my heart and a whole bunch of other ones in my neck, and that turned out to be this amazing spiritual journey. There was a lot of symbolism and different things like that, and that's another example of you have a choice in a moment like that. And I realized intuitively, fairly quickly, and I'm not going to say it was immediate because there was a period of uncertainty at the beginning and even at the end where I was not exactly the most spiritual and aligned being, and certainly a bit terrified. But there were, I realized shortly after that this my approach to it was, these tumors came to give me a gift, and that gift was, there were a lot of different gifts actually that came from that, just an opening emotionally, realizing, for example, that tears of joy are real. I didn't realize just how shut off I had been emotionally in a lot of different respects. And the love that I experienced that surrounded me, even from complete strangers when I went through that, was wild. Part of it was because of the way that I handled it. There's a lot of people who talk about kicking cancer's ass and I'm going to fight this and whatnot. And I realized right up front, I'm like, I don't give myself particularly good odds going up against nature. And so rather than swim upstream and fight and kick and scream and complain and cry and whine and whatnot, I was like, you know what, let's look at this differently. And my friend Jackie was going through metastatic breast cancer at the time, and she and I used to talk about it. And she was the one who gave me the vocabulary around it. She said, let's walk with it. Let's learn from it. If the quicker we get the lessons, the faster we can move on to the next thing. And, again, letting something come to its full circle. And, I'm not going to say it was a picnic. It was not a picnic going through, the 300 or 500 hours of chemo or whatever it was. But it was a beautiful journey in many respects. And it was something that by embracing it and acknowledging it and learning from it, I think we always have a choice. Now, that said, I do feel compelled to add a little caveat there. I think even the word cancer is something we need to rethink the vocabulary around, because if you look at health as a spectrum from say 0 to 100, on the one side, you've got things like cuts and scrapes and broken bones and flus and whatnot that might be the first couple of 1, 2, 3 or whatever on that 100-point scale. But then when you get into cancer and tumors and things, they could legitimately start around 7, 8, 9 and go all the way to 100. And so to describe something that I had, which was curable, even though like when my dad was in medical school, it was not curable, it was a death sentence. But by the time I had it, thank God they had a cure for it. And so it was considered curable. So to say that what I had, and to equate that and even use the same word for it as somebody who's dealing with something that, is going to end their life in a matter of days or weeks, does a tremendous disservice to somebody who's got a much more severe diagnosis. And so I'm not sitting here saying that somebody who's got pancreatic cancer and a very short life expectancy should somehow magically adapt that mindset, because candidly, I don't think that's necessarily appropriate. Who knows why they got it? I am not an expert. I'm not going to sit there and pretend. If they can, in that moment, look and it feels right to them to look and see if there's a gift somehow, even in that shorter life expectancy, good for them. I'm not saying they should do that or that that's the right thing. It was the right thing for me to look at it that way.
All right, it's a resonance thing, and by that I mean, if like almost like intuition, if you are drawn to it and it, it's something like you heard and was like, hey, I want to know more about that, then by all means, research it, go in, look into it, follow it. But if you hear it and you're like, I got nothing, then don't attack it. Don't, do it. Just accept that, it's not for you and move on.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, before we got online, we were talking a bit about the past life thing. And one of the areas that I think is really interesting that's worth talking about is the idea of, what value is there in even knowing what your past lives are and what can you possibly learn from it? Because that to me is, we're on a journey and the tumors were a journey, the past life experiences that I've had were part of the journey. And one of the things that I always tell people is look for the synchronicities. What are the things that you have been interested in that may or may not have a past life connection, and that's where some of the magic is. Like, so for example, a couple of examples that come to mind. There was I had mentioned the interest in the music and whatnot the first time around. Well, one of the interests that I had, and I still do, was there's a guy named Tom Brown Jr. who started a thing called the Tracker School. And
Correct.
Tom died about a month ago, but he had learned, he was like 70 something when he died. But when he was 11 years old, there was an 80 something year old Lipan Apache who had never lived in civilization, who saw Tom collecting fossils by a riverbed. And he recognized Tom from a vision that he had had in the late 1800s when he was a boy, and recognized him as somebody that he was supposed to teach. Because when he had the vision, he had never even seen a white person. And when he went to the elders, this is the Indian's name was Grandfather or Stalking Wolf. And he went to his elders at the time and said, well, what does this vision mean? They said, when you see that boy, you'll know what to do. And when he saw Tom, when Tom was 11 years old, he realized that he was supposed to do that. So I'd read all these books on, that Tom had written. He has a bunch of field guides of, for tracking and nature and edible and medicinal plants and things. And then he has a whole bunch of books that he had written that are more autobiographical, but they're more about the journey that he had with Stalking Wolf and what he learned from them, or what he learned from him rather. And so I was very interested in, through that, Native Americans and whatnot. Well, around the same time, I had gone to an Akashic record class and I met this woman, and her name was Sally. And she offered just to do a reading for me one day. She wasn't even charging me. She just, she was a psychic and she tuned in. And one of the things that she picked up on was that I had in the 12th century, she said, you were a Native American medicine man. And of course, I'm excited because I'm, interested in all that, and I was reading about it and whatnot. And so I asked her, my first question, for who knows why, what reason, I said, what was my name? And she paused and she said, I'm getting that's not important. I said, okay, fair enough. I said, what tribe was I with? Because I wanted to see if there was, something that I was supposed to learn or whatever. And now I'm secretly wishing that she's going to say, or hoping that she's going to say Lippin Apache, because that was what I had been reading about, or Sioux, because, Dances with Wolves was really popular around then. And, the Sioux tribe seemed pretty cool. And, there was lots of different tribes that I had heard of that I thought, were pretty interesting, Cherokee, whatever. Well, she pauses and she looks at me and she's like, Chippewa. And my first reaction was, I was a little disappointed. I'm like, okay, that seems kind of boring. And I'm like, Chippewa. And she's like, yeah. She said, that's what I'm getting. I said, okay, fair enough. So the next day, I look up Chippewa online. I do a little Google search. The third entry down at the time was the Chippewa of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Okay, let me explain why this is important. I am the only person in my family, immediate family and extended to a large degree, who was not born in Chicago. We were all born in Chicago. I mean, you'd have to go back, way back to my great grandparents or whatever to find somebody who was not born in Chicago. And I was born in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan is a teeny tiny little town up on the Canadian border. And the reason we were up there is at the time, my dad was in the Air Force at Kinchelo Air Force Base, which happens to be in Sault Ste. Marie. Now, my dad was really into, the psychic stuff. He was a doctor and he had even gone to law school and stuff, but he was still very open to spiritual type things. And so I excitedly called him because I knew he had this big connection to Sault Ste. Marie. And I said, I told him what Sally had said. And he paused and he looked at me and he said, yes. And he said, you were born in Chippewa County. I was like, wow, I would never have even thought that. Okay. Then the next day I'm at the gym. I'm working out and I see a guy at the gym I've never seen before. And what caught my attention was he had a shirt on with this really interesting it was like a Southwestern design. And it was, and then when I looked at it more closely, it wasn't really the design that was what captured my attention. But then I looked and it was Indians on horseback, and on his shoulder, right on that part of the shirt, it said Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. That is the one and only time I have ever seen anybody with a shirt from my birthplace. So there it was, 3 confirmations of what Sally had told me within 24 hours of her reading and her unsolicited observation that I was a Chippewa. I shouldn't say unsolicited. I did ask her about the tribe, but if she were, if you think about the criticism of psychics, so they tell you what you want to hear. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. I was, if she was able to pick up on, things like that, she would have picked a different tribe. But there it was. So it's pretty interesting.
Right. And one of the things that was, in all honesty, we talked about as well before we started the recording was a lot of people like to ask, how do I know when I'm experiencing a past life versus a dream versus, deja vu or any of that? What is the telltale sign to where I can say to someone, yes, this is a past life memory or experience coming through?
I don't have I'm not an expert. I'm not going to sit here and say that I have an exact answer to that, but here's what my thinking on that is, that when it comes through for a reason. And it has a connection that makes sense in terms of your current experience or something you're dealing with or whatever. So, for example, one of the I did a past life regression because I was a big fan, or I am a big fan of Brian Weiss's books like Many Lives, Many Masters, Third Time into Healing, and some of those other books he had written. So I had contacted Dr. Weiss's office to look for a referral for somebody in Chicago who did past life regression, somebody that he found credible. So he gave me the name of a guy named Dr. Hauk. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he was in Hyde Park. And I went out and I did a session with Dr. Hauk. Dr. Hauk, when he put me under hypnosis, one of the first things, actually, I think it was first or second life that we uncovered, I was sitting in a wheelchair because he said, bring me to the moment of your death. And I was sitting in a wheelchair with a white gown on in the middle of this beautiful, like all I can picture is like green fields and trees and rolling hills and whatnot. And what I was describing in terms of other people around in wheelchairs and, doctors or orderlies or whatever, pushing them around, he said, we had identified it was something from the late 1800s. And it was like a mental hospital of some sort. Now, again, the criticism of, past life stuff is people say, oh, you come back and, everybody thinks they were Jesus. Okay. There's nothing particularly aspirational about seeing yourself in a past life in a mental institution. But what was interesting about that was that he said, bring me back, to when you, something that happened before you got to that hospital. And the next thing I know, I'm in the back of this horse-drawn carriage, and I was a mother, and there were two kids, a boy and a girl, and the younger was the girl, and these big, bright blue eyes. As soon as I looked at her, I realized that it was my ex-girlfriend, Amy, who she and I had just broken up a couple months before. And Amy had those same sea blue eyes. And I realized in that moment, it was like, wow, we had a connection. And even in that lifetime, we weren't meant to be together for the whole time. I never saw her again after that. And, as we talked about it, it was probably tuberculosis or something, because I had a lot of back pain or something. I couldn't even really stand up. And as I'm in the back of this horse-drawn carriage, and they, threw me in, and, there I was separated from my kids and never saw them again. And so that was, did that feel right? Because that's one of the questions that I was asked, whether it's whatever sort of experience it is, or whether I have just had a meeting with an intuitive or somebody who does that sort of work. I was asked, how do I feel right now? Does that feel right? Does it feel like there's some connection, or did I get something out of this experience that makes sense of something else that's happened? So, different example. One of the things that I was always fascinated by was the Titanic. I can't even tell you how many books I've read on the Titanic. It was just something, along with the books on Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and other things that I was fascinated about. That was something that captured my imagination. So naturally, when the movie Titanic came out, I went to see it. And as I'm watching this movie, there was one character in particular, and I'm not going to say who it was, but there was somebody who was connected with the ship management and whatnot. I felt this really strong connection to that character. So yeah, I thought, okay, that's really interesting, but I didn't, think anything about it other than the fact that it was just a character that really caught my attention. Well, not long after that, the Titanic exhibit was going around, and I had seen it in Chicago, and I happened to be in Phoenix, Arizona, when when the exhibit was there. And what's interesting about that exhibit is it changes every city. It's, they have different artifacts, and they have different, cool little exhibits and stuff. And this particular time, the one and only time I've seen it in London, I've seen it in Chicago, I've seen it in Phoenix, I saw it somewhere else. This is the one and only time that they had people who were dressed in period attire. And I was there, and it was like a Tuesday or something in the morning. There was no one else around. And yet there was this woman who was dressed like a first-class passenger sort of thing, long evening gown. And she comes up to me and she said, "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" I looked at her. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't have a boarding pass," because I had walked past, wherever they were giving them out, and just didn't see anybody, didn't know that was something I was supposed to get. And she looked at me and she smiled and she said, "No problem, I will get you one." And so she goes back and she gets me the boarding pass. The boarding pass that she got me is the same person from Harlan and Wolff, I think that's the name of the shipping company, that I had that reaction to in the movie. And I'm looking at it going, no way did she just give me this boarding pass of all the 2,000 plus boarding passes she could have given me. And what was interesting was she and I actually became friends. So we went on a date that night. And although we didn't have a connect, we felt there was definitely a connection between us, like almost immediately. And it was not, as it turned out, a romantic connection, but we stayed in touch. And subsequently, we both had sessions with intuitives who both told us that we knew each other and that she was a first class passenger and I was one of the people from the shipping company. So it was really wild that all of those things lined up. And then later on, one of my dear friends now also, it turns out, has a connection to the Titanic, and she was also a first class passenger. I think those two women survived and I didn't. But it was interesting that, they came around again. And so much like Amy, my ex-girlfriend, there's how she had showed up in that one past life regression. I do believe that, from a reincarnation standpoint, we travel with a lot of the same souls. And so, is this dream that you're having, going back to your question, is the dream that you're having or the experience or what you're being told by an intuitive, does it tie together some things that, where it starts to make sense of, like in my case, the Titanic, it started to make sense of all the books that I had read and why I was so fascinated by it. The people on board who kept coming up, the names that kept coming up as significant or that I felt a connection to, as opposed to some random past life where somebody says, "Oh yeah, you were a gladiator in Rome," and I'd be like, "Okay, yeah, great, so thanks." Doesn't help me. With my dad, he was convinced he had a past life in Italy, in Rome, because his first visit to Rome, first of all, he was a classics major. He loved Latin and Greek and encouraged all of us to take Latin, and so definitely had a very strong connection to the language. But he said his first trip to Rome, as he walked around the city, he knew what was going to be around the next corner, and he had never been there before. And it's not like he had studied all the maps or anything like that, but in a way, he never used the word home, but that's the word I'm going to use. It had a very familiar feeling to him, probably because of a past life. So in that case, you could see where the connection would be. There's other times that you might have a dream, and if it doesn't, to my way of thinking anyway, if it doesn't correspond to anything that you've experienced to this point, or that helps make sense of something that happens after, it was probably just some random dream. If it was something where you're like, hey, this helps me understand better these other things that I've experienced, then there's a chance that there's more to it than that. That would be my answer, and how I would, my litmus test for, is it significant or is it just this random thing?
And I love that, and I think you explained it really well. And for me, interestingly enough, when I was in Rome and touring the city, I was going to locations and, like, example of going in the Pantheon. And all of a sudden, when I stepped foot in there, you would think you're in awe of this architecture. You're, wow, and everything. I got hit with a intense anger and sadness and going, where are the statues? Why did they remove the statue of the gods to put up these? And I always am like, don't get me wrong, I don't, have anything against the angels and the saints that are up now in the Pantheon, but I'm like, they destroyed the old to put that in its place. And I would go around and I'd see the ruins, and it'd make me inside be like angry of, here they're destroying the history of this. But I would find myself in my mind going, this isn't what we fought for. This isn't what we died for, to have this being looking like this. Like, I went to the Circus Maximus, and it's just an empty field. They took all the stones away for other buildings. And I was like, really? That was a huge monument. That was a huge, like, landmark. To just make it a open field and say, here it is. It's like, almost to me, it was like a slap in the face kind of feeling.
Yeah. So my question to you on that is, do you feel so? what was your role? Let me ask it as a more open-ended question. What do you think your role was in ancient Rome as it related to some of these landmarks?
I feel like I was a legionnaire because the one thing I kept looking for was where are the legionnaires? Because that was like the big thing. If you couldn't be a senator, was to be a legionnaire because that was the second most respected position in the culture. And I finally found the mark of the legionnaire, and it literally, I could feel my blood start to boil because it's on the grates to lead into the sewers.
Oh, wow.
The mark of the Legionnaire is now on the covers into the sewers. And I was like, that is just that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I also then found out I actually did ancestry and found out I have ancestors who were tied to Rome, and so in different positions. And so it's like, yeah, so it's like I got a double whammy of here's my family's history and past life history all being affected. And the part that infuriated me was there was one organization that was instrumental in dismantling everything, and it's like so wrong. And they even used the title of what they destroyed, and it's like, and I don't want to say who it is because I don't want to open up the floodgates on people coming after me saying you shouldn't be speaking ill of this organization. But yeah, I mean, it just was interesting. And to me, like you're saying, that was such a visceral experience and feeling that had to be past life because being an American stepping foot into Italy shouldn't have mattered to me what they had done.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was interesting because I had another session with a channeler one time. And one of the things that she told me is she said, you in your travels will encounter places where she's like, your feet will touch the ground and you will be angry and you will feel. And it was interesting what you were describing because she had mentioned that would happen. And she'd said that it would happen in Spain. Now, it hasn't happened to me in Spain yet, but it was interesting how a number of years ago, I was traveling around, and in Italy, I made the decision that I wanted to go to the Amalfi Coast. And so the minute I made that decision, I started getting that TMJ, the jaw pain. And I thought this is really weird because that's usually associated with stress. And here I'm on vacation, and there's this jaw pain that's coming up, and I'm like, whatever. So I go to the thing, I take the train to Naples, and then I go on to some of the different cities along the Amalfi Coast. And as I get down there, the jaw pain gets worse and worse. And I had booked a hotel for 2 nights. And the first night I'm there, I'm walking around and it's beautiful. And I'm looking around thinking, wow, this place is amazing. This would be, a really cool romantic, place for like a honeymoon or whatever. And it's just a beautiful place. But I didn't feel comfortable there at all. And then I thought about it and I was like, I don't have anything to prove to anybody. If I'm not feeling comfortable energetically, I need to trust that. And so I went back to the hotel and I looked at the guy and I said, what time is the first bus out of here? And he said, well, the first bus is at 6 a.m. But he said, I thought you were staying 2 nights. And I said, yeah, I thought I was too, but I'm not. And so I made the decision to leave. And as soon as that bus left the next day, that jaw pain went away. And interestingly, I went to, rather than spend, the time in Sorrento and Positano and Ravello and all those places, which I had visited quickly, that the first day, I went to Rome and I spent the entire day because I've been to Rome a number of times and just walked around Rome because I love Rome. I always felt a nice connection to Rome, not in terms of it necessarily like a past life, but just feeling really comfortable there and loving that city. And it was interesting how quickly that jaw pain cleared up. I have no idea why, I don't, who knows? But what she had said about, if you had a traumatic, experience in a past life, you could easily feel that when you set foot. And I love the fact that in your case, in the Pantheon and at Circus Maximus, you could identify very clearly why you were having that. Like in my case, I just knew that I was having this physical experience that was negative, that was associated clearly with where I was, but I have no idea what the past life was. And I don't know, in that case, it would be really interesting to know. And I think if it were important, I probably would have found out. But in your case, it's one of those things that I would be looking for, as you move forward. Any other, uh, I would be probably reading, books on some of those folks that you were talking about, just to learn and see, what are those connections? Because when you have past lives, a lot of times there are connections. Like, for example, well, this is an interesting one too. I had forgotten about this till just now. I hadn't shared this one ever, but it's in the book, but I haven't shared it on any interviews. There was a past life that was uncovered. And again, I'm not going to say who it is because I don't want to get into discussions about it. It's not about name dropping or anything like that. But it was this woman had this amazing channeler had said, she answered all my questions without me asking any of them, which was incredible. She just started talking for 45 minutes. And one of the very first things that she said to me was, she said, "So where does this speaking and writing ability come from? We will tell you now," in this very like sing-songy voice. And then she goes on to describe all these different lifetimes I had had as a writer or a poet. Well, I had one lifetime in England where I was a writer, and I focused very much on the employment issues of the day and social issues related to employment and things like that. And this is a name that you would know. And I thought, well, this is really fascinating because my first book was about job search and about helping people get a job. And I didn't know that past life connection until, that point. And so here she was, later on, pointing out that was something, that was common thread. There's always been this common thread of writing and social justice and things like that. That's always been important to me on some level. And even now in this lifetime, I get really frustrated sometimes when I see friends who are dealing with different things in the justice system, that are clearly unjust. And that triggers me. And it triggers me more than you would think, given that I haven't really had any experiences, comparable to the things that my friends are going through. But that was exactly what I was writing about in these other lifetimes, apparently. So, again, you can, it's those, what are those triggers? And I love that, when you talked about the fact that, it triggered you, that they weren't honoring the people who played, the role that you did in the way that they probably should have. It helps make sense in that moment of the anger or frustration that you might be feeling. So that's, again, there's that validation. And then to me, also an important part of just letting go and being able to say, okay, it's not my battle this time, let it go.
Right. And I love how you bring that up because I was going to say is growing up in the metaphysical community, one of the things that we're taught is, so say like I go, I want to go to Ireland, but I'm like, you're like, okay, yeah, who won it? But then like next year comes and you're like, yeah, I still haven't gone. It's like, man, I really need to go to Ireland. And you're feeling called and drawn to this place. And you're like, I really got to go. And you end up going and you have an experience there. And what the principle is they call it like soul, it's not soul retrieval, but it's like a soul aspect of yours is calling, ready to return to you to make you one and whole. And so one of the things that I start to look at now is when people, like I'm doing research, and if someone says, hey, let's go to this place, and I'm like, I just researched that, I will put top priority to making that trip happen because I'm like, something is drawing me there.
There you
Something like a piece of me is there. So I need to go retrieve it. and don't know how to do that, what it looks like. But I just know, like, with Rome. And one of the funny ones of that trip was we were also supposed to go to Carthage on that trip. And we ended up not being able to make it. And I was feeling disappointed because I was like, I really wanted to see Carthage. And I was like, man, I not stepped foot on there. And I'm like, I probably won't now because, travel's gotten so iffy, depending on the rules and changes daily. So I'm like, okay, well, I got a chance to go to, say, Spain, Sicily, Italy, all these places. And I'm like, it's really cool. And I start to look and I'm like, every place I've stepped foot in, I can almost say 98% guarantee past life there. And so I'm wondering if that kind of, as you're looking at past lives too, if you start to notice a trend of where I end up going and stepping foot is more than just vacation or this, it's a calling and a drawn to.
Yeah, I would agree with that because there's a particular country in Europe that uh, I didn't visit the first one or two times that I came to Europe, and then when I did, I've now seen more cities in that country than any other country in Europe, and I'm absolutely convinced that I had a past life there. I feel very comfortable there. It's just uh, it's interesting and not something that I ever would have expected because it's not like like if you traced my ancestry, it's more Irish. But this is a country in mainland Europe that I have much bigger connection to. And it's so yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to that, and that's what makes it fun. As long as it's for people who are, if you're anybody who's interested in it, like I said, just pay attention to those little synchronicities, pay attention to those things, where do you feel drawn, like you said, because that's where, if you trust the process and you just like going, let's say, let's see what happens. That's, maybe something's going to happen. Maybe it isn't. Like I had somebody tell me that they thought that I would have a connection with Portugal in terms of, as a potential place even to settle down. And I spent this summer traveling around Portugal, and I love Portugal. Portugal is beautiful, but I don't have any particular interest in living there. And so it's not always going to play out the way that you think it might. And I was hoping that it would in a way because it's beautiful. It's on the coast. It's, the weather's nice and whatnot. It would have been kind of cool if it worked out, but it just didn't feel right the way that I had hoped it would. And so, but you got to trust that because then that means that you're probably meant to be somewhere else. And that's more about, and it goes back to the whole idea of the only reason to look into any of that is to make your current incarnation more interesting and more fun and more fulfilling. Because, otherwise, it's not, becoming an expert on who you were in your past life. Okay, fine, great. There's certainly people I could, study any of the people that I know that I was, in the cases where there's research available about it, but it's not that interesting necessarily. It's more just bigger picture to be able to say, what on a surface level, what have I gained from that? If I felt drawn to study them, I would certainly do that. I have one friend who is very passionate about a historical figure, and she spends a lot of time researching that person and is working on a book around that. Great, that's her calling, that's her that's her thing, and that's making this current experience more interesting. For me, it's just part of the overall mosaic of all the different things that I've done in the past.
Right. And, talking about the Irish, I don't know where I saw this or if I dreamt it, but there was, or, when I say dreamt, meaning vision, but I saw the Irish with indigenous tribes, and after the potato famine coming and being greeted as friends, and they were saying because the Chippewa or not Chippewa, but the indigenous tribe, I forget which one it was, had just come off of famine, and Ireland had just started their famine. So they raised like $140 and sent it over to Ireland. And so an Irishman came over to the indigenous and said, "Thank you for, your help." And they were greeted as friends and they were friendly. And I'm like, I can't help but think, how influential the Irish have been through the Americas and all over the world and the indigenous as well. And it was through this spirit of helping one another. Whereas nowadays you look at, well, who's helping who? And it's like, well, you don't really see it unless someone's getting something. They're like, yeah, we'll help you if you help us with this. Or there's like conditions now. And I'm like, yeah, we lost the sense of help just for the sake of helping because we overcame. So we're going to help the next ones to overcome
Yeah.
instead of, this or that. But I also am curious, back to the past lives and everything. Do you feel like when people say they lucid dream and they're in these dreams and they may be like, say, in France and walking around this cities that are no longer existing, do you think that's past life information coming in, and it's the way the mind is like, hey, we can easily integrate this and bring it up and you can look into it when you wake up?
That's an interesting question. I honestly don't know, because I could imagine that it could be that, or it could be just the people who are able to do, the out of body experiences and projections and get their consciousness to a different place, not necessarily a place where they lived before, but just a place that, was suggested of, okay, let's go here and do that. I know, there's people who do that remote viewing, for example, where they do see some of that. And I don't necessarily think there's a past life connection with it. It's just that the suggestion was made, go there and check it out. If they were, if there was no suggestion made and they just ended up there, then the odds are, yeah, there probably was a reason that they went. In a past life is as good a reason as any, so who
Right.
knows?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. And one of the things too that I'm kind of interested to pick your mind about a little bit with past lives, we talk about, you've mentioned a couple times, like, why do we only focus on, or, why do we care past lives, what's going on and everything? Why do we look at it? And one thing I can say I've noticed through my personal experiences, patterns in life to where, say, for example, you get $100 in your account and someone pays you, but then something comes up and you end up paying for that and you're back to the $100 in your account. You can never exceed 100. Well, people may say, well, that's because, life happens. But if it's, a repetitive pattern, I look at going, wait a minute, where is this pattern coming from? Is it something I learned in this life, or is it past life and something they need to look at? And I, I mean, you kind of touched on it sideways with your experiences of,
Yeah.
it being attached to past life and not realizing it. And so I'm wondering your thoughts of when we see things like, several failed relationships or inability to succeed to a certain point or unable to do certain things that you keep wanting to do, but something gets in the way. Do you feel like with the time of awakening, so to speak, that we are, and I'm not talking woke, I mean awakening spiritually, that they're bringing the lessons of the past lives that we need to absolutely look at and learn to the surface, and that's why those patterns are becoming more aware?
Yeah, I would say there's probably a lot of validity to what you're saying there, because it does, whenever there's a repeating pattern, the question is always, what am I supposed to learn from this? And is it, like it could be a repeating dream, it could be a repeating struggle to get past a certain point, as you mentioned, in terms of financially. And then, asking that question, what am I supposed to learn? And then listening for the answer and being aware to tune into that. It literally, there's an infinite number of things that it could end up being. But the point is, I do believe the universe gives us lessons and gives us experiences over and over again. Often the same type of experience, with different people who are bringing the experience to us. So it's not, like you mentioned, like failed relationships or whatever. There are these patterns that show up and different actors are playing the part. It's like in each case, okay, how do I get, how do I get past this? What do I need to do? What do I need to learn? What do I need to see? What do I need to let go of? And there's one of the resources that helped me, take the relationship side of things. And whether you're talking about friendship, romantic, whatever, it doesn't matter. We get stuck in relationships all the time. And there's a wonderful book called Radical Forgiveness by, I think his name is Colin Tipping. There's two books, I think, by the same title, and I think one's by a woman and one's by a guy. It's the book by the guy, Colin, that I read and really got a lot out of. And in that, he talks about some of the recurring patterns and things like that. He tells this amazing story at the beginning of the book about his sister and what she was dealing with in a relationship, and how when she was thinking about leaving her husband, he basically sat her down and said, and I'm not going to give too many of the details away, but he basically said, you have every right to leave. He's, not being a good husband. However, consider the fact that he's the second or third person to do this to you. And you have an important opportunity here to heal the situation and figure out where it's coming from so that you can move past it. Or, but if you don't, be aware that this is likely to play out in your next relationship with the next person, and it will be a different guy with a different name and a different face, and maybe not even a different name, by the way, because it was interesting how even some of the names, it's like the universe really wants us to get it, and the name will be similar to a name that had triggered us in the past. And it definitely happened in my case as I was working through the book, and I was thinking about, there were two people who had very similar names, and they were bringing up some of the very same issues, for me. And I had never really thought about even that aspect. It's like the universe really wants us to get it. But we, it's, sometimes I know I can speak for myself. I can be a bit on the thick side, and I don't always see what, the universe needs me to see. Well, and even a quick funny example that I had a situation, and this is a friendship with a guy that I had met, and he was a very talented musician, and he was somebody. It was really cool when we became friends because he was. I play a little bit of guitar, but he was teaching me some songs, and he's like, "I want you to play on my next album," which of course I was really excited about because I'm basically a hack. And so our friendship was developing and whatnot, and then all of a sudden he stopped talking to me. And he, we had gone from hanging out a couple times a week to I hadn't heard from him. And so I called up. I had heard that he had started dating a woman that I had dated 6 months before. And so I called her up and I said, I know he's got a big birthday coming up, but I don't remember the exact date, and I don't want to, forget it because I certainly want to acknowledge that birthday. But I said, but I haven't heard from him. And she pauses and she says, and you're not going to hear from him either. And I'm like, why? What are you talking about? And she said, well, she said, he thinks you lied to him. And I said, lied to him about what? And she's like, about us. And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she said, he asked you if we had ever dated, and you told him that we hadn't. And she sounded really annoyed at that moment. And I said to her, I said, that is not my recollection of the conversation at all. My recollection is if we were dating, and because we weren't, I encouraged him to ask you out because I knew you were interested in him and he was clearly interested in you. And now you guys are going out. So I failed to see the harm in this. And she said, she goes, well, I said, what difference does it make? And she's like, well, he has a policy that he won't date anybody that any of his friends have ever dated. And I'm like, what are we, 11? But so I'm very frustrated and very, and feeling misunderstood and kind of attacked and just a lot of conflicting emotions. But my very first thought was, okay, yes, it takes two people to miscommunicate. And sometimes it's easier to just own it. And so I picked up the phone and I called them up and I said, hey, I'm really sorry. I owe you an apology. I said, I thought the question you were asking me was, are we dating? Not, have we ever dated? Have we ever dated? Yeah, absolutely. And, I had no intention to mislead you. And certainly would have done it if I thought that there were, consequences and real, anything along those lines. I literally just didn't understand your question. But yes, we did date, and I understand you guys are going out now, which is great. I wish you the best. Would love to talk to you about it and clear the air. I never heard from him, and I knew I wasn't going to. Now, here's why this was important, and it goes along with the lessons and things like that. So I started getting, at first I was feeling, embarrassed and misunderstood. And then over the next couple of days, I started getting more and more frustrated and angry. I'm like, what is the deal? Like, why does this even matter? And so as I'm getting frustrated, I start getting sick. And I know myself well enough to know now, in my case, if I get congestion, as an example, it's a sign that there's a conversation that I need to have that I'm not having. And so I was asking myself, if I get a cold, okay, what am I not communicating? What am I keeping inside? Well, in this case, I knew what conversation I needed to have that I wasn't having, but I couldn't do anything about it because he wasn't willing to engage. And so I started getting sicker and sicker. I started getting swollen glands, I had a fever. And I called my dad because my dad was a doc. And I said, Dad, I described the symptoms and I said, what can I do? And he said, nothing. He said, you've got the really bad flu that's going around. And I said, well, is there anything I can take for it? He said, no, it's a virus. He said, you just got to, sleep it out. And I said, well, how long am I likely to have this? This is on a Saturday night. And he said, my patients have had it for 2 weeks. And I said, but I've got an out of town speaking gig on Wednesday. He said, you are not going to be there. You're going to need to find somebody else. So in this moment, he goes, just go to bed. So I've got my fever. I'm not feeling that great. So I just took his advice. I went up to bed and I prayed. And because I said, and it was literally along the lines of, God, I need your help. The conversation that I most need to have is never going to happen. And it never did happen, by the way. Sadly, the guy died a couple of years later. And, even though I was totally open to talking to him and had reached out, nothing ever happened. And I knew in my heart nothing was ever going to happen. I just had that feeling. And I didn't know why, but I just knew that was the case. And so I said, I need your help. I need to let go of this. I'm feeling a lot of anger and frustration and whatnot. I need to let go. And so what I get was an image. I get somebody told me the name of this and I'm forgetting. It's if you picture the Da Vinci, the circle with the guy in the middle with his arms out and his legs out. It's some medical thing. Yeah. That image in the circle was this friend of mine, and this guy he's like 6'5", 300 pounds. He's a big dude. He's taking up that space in the circle, but on top of that, superimposed on this 300-pound guy, is my little nephew Steele, who was 3 years old at the time. Steele, in his 3-year-old body, was taking up the exact same space as this bigger guy, and who's 47 years older. And I'm like, and I literally laughed out loud. I said, that's a really interesting image, but I don't get it. And so, when I say, the universe gives us things over and over again until we get it, sometimes, somebody who's thick like me and doesn't necessarily get the symbolism of stuff, have to be a little more direct. So I laughed and I said, I don't get it. I heard a voice. Now, this was not a male voice. It was not a female voice. It was just a voice. And the exact words were, he is at the emotional development level of a 3-year-old. It is not his fault. Be more compassionate. And I, like, in an instant, I got it. And it was the perfect image for the universe to give me in that moment, because Would I be mad at a 3-year-old for a misunderstanding? No, of course not, because the 3-year-old is, you don't get upset with a 3-year-old about something like that, because clearly they're not going to get it. They're not at that level. And what they were communicating was, or what the universe was communicating in that moment was, he may be old, 47 years older, but it doesn't mean that he's any more mentally mature or whatever. And there's no judgment in that, by the way. I'm not making him wrong for that. We are where we are spiritually, developmentally, emotionally, developmentally, whatever. We're all in different places. It is what it is. And I needed to just let it go. And in that moment, I was able to let it go, because the universe realized that I needed a much more direct message in that moment. And thank God I got it. And so over the course of that evening, I woke up drenched in sweat. Twice I had to change my clothes before the morning. When I woke up in the morning, I was completely fine. I was completely healed. And literally to this day, I have never once, a lot of times when you fight with somebody, you still do the, winning imaginary arguments in the shower and replaying the event. I literally was able to just let it go. I've never once had even a second of animosity or frustration or anything toward him or that situation, because I let it go. And I understood it, and I forgave him, and I forgave myself and all the rest of it. It's just, the power of being able to let it go. But it was one of those things that, if I hadn't let that go, that would have played out probably in other relationships and other things. And until we break the cycle, those things are going to keep coming back.
Right. And one of the things that's interesting too in metaphysics is we're taught, people come into the lives to help learn a lesson and then move on, or they can stay. They're at choice. And so not to be attached to the outcome, so what that means is like, you could be the best of friends, for 3 years, and then it'll just stop. And it's like, we're like, okay, so the lessons were learned, we're parting ways, cool. Or, this or that. And I mean, people have asked me, like, how do you do that? I'm like, well, it's just the way of balancing the world. And they're like, don't you feel anything? I'm like, well, yeah, I feel sad that, losing a friend, but I'm not really losing a friend because he's still or she's still out there doing her thing or his thing, and our paths may cross again at some point. Or, our paths are not going to cross anymore at all. But, I don't know what the next phase is. And so it's like, I'm like, yeah, I'm sad over this moment. And so in reality, it ended up teaching me how to be in a moment where instead of everything past, present, and future in one place and thinking, oh my God, this is how this is played out in the past. I don't want to do this again. How do I stop it? And then you're like, well, this is the present affecting by the past because I don't want to repeat this. And I want to change and then you realize if I just be in this moment, they all answer and figure themselves out. And it's like so much more zen and so much more calm and less stressful, but it is really hard to get there.
It totally is. And that's why there's a title of a poem that sums it up really well for me. It's that, people come into our life for, it's a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And if we're attached to them sticking around, then that's not a great place to be, because to your point, maybe we've, come together. Now there's other people who, you might come together, and I have people like this in my life, and I love it when it happens where, we'll be together for a period of time. And I don't mean like in a romantic way necessarily, but like just, even a business relationship. And then we drift apart, but then we come back, and then, but sometimes to your point, you may drift apart and that was it. That's come done to its completion. There's of course going to be a sadness. You say goodbye to people, and the idea that you're not going to see them again, or that you don't know when the last goodbye is or was. It's just part of life, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Can we pause for a quick minute? I need to run to the bathroom. Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay, so we're back, and I have one really last question for you because, this has been such a very informative and such a fun and exciting episode. Is how can people find you if they want to get a hold of you to ask questions or, share experiences with you?
Oh, thank you. I love that. So I love the shared experiences part too, because that's something that we're going to build into the website over time as people share more stories. Because the short answer to the question is my website is called atrekwithin.com. And if you go to the website, which is the same as the title to the book, you can connect with me, send me a message. But you can also, if you're interested, you can download a free chapter of the book, either as a PDF or you can we did an audio book as well. So you can download the audio free chapter and just see if it resonates, because we are all about sharing stories. And the book itself has dozens of stories from other people, because it's not just me and my experiences. There's other people, some people who are friends and some people who are strangers who heard about the project who wanted to share stories. There's a ton of different stories in the book, and each chapter has a lot of those stories within it. So atrekwithin.com would be the easiest and best place to reach. And by the way, if people do have comments, I will try to watch the comments section. If they have questions that they want to put in the comments, I'll do my best to respond. But if you don't hear from me, reach out through the website for sure. I'm happy to connect. And I appreciate you asking that question, because always looking to build the community and get more find more people who have similar experiences and ways of thinking and being.
Right. And where can people find your book?
Amazon, Audible, any major bookstore, you can order it through. They're not likely to have it on the shelf at this point. As we build momentum and more people hear about it, then at some point, that'll be the case. But you can certainly order it very easily on any of the major platforms. Barnes and Noble, any of those things.
Okay. And so at the end of the episode, I like to ask a question, and a lot of the fans that watch the show really enjoy this part. And it's kind of a way of tying everything together. And that is, out of your life's experiences, doesn't have to be over what we talked about, it could be over anything. But what would be a golden nugget that you would like to leave the audience with?
Wow. Let me think about that. The biggest one that's coming to mind is the importance of being open to feedback. And so there's a little story that goes with this. Do we have a minute? Because I want to be respectful
Sure.
of yours. Okay. So a number of years ago, I had dated a woman named Amber, and Amber and I had met playing beach volleyball. And when we broke up, it was very amicable. Amicable. We just realized that we weren't necessarily meant to. It wasn't. It was a reason in the season. It was not a lifetime. We'll put it that way. And so, a couple months after we broke up, she called me up and she said, "Rob, I've got some feedback for you that I think is going to help you in future relationships, but I don't have time to talk now." So I'm like, okay. So she says, can I come by later? And I said, of course. So she came by, it was literally 4 hours later. It's Friday afternoon. And I'm human. I spent the first 3 of those 4 hours just spinning around in my head, winning those imaginary arguments we talked about earlier. And then it finally dawned on me. It's like, wait a minute. Neither one of us wants to get back together. She's giving me feedback that she thinks is going to help me. Rob, be open, be grateful for it. And so, I shifted in that moment to, rather than being defensive, to being, grateful in advance for whatever she was going to share. When she comes over, she said, Rob, she goes, remember that story you told me about your grandfather? And the one that she was referring to was after he died, we found thank you notes from tons of people for things that he had done where he was very generous. He was the person who, at church would donate uniforms for the kids who didn't have money for uniforms, usually anonymously. I don't think my grandmother even realized that he was the anonymous donor who did all the things. He had put somebody through college that we have no idea who the person was. There were all these things that he had done. And I had mentioned to Amber that I wanted to be generous at that level of generosity. And she looked at me like a great coach and she said, "You are exactly the opposite." And she proceeded, when I say like a great coach, she proceeded to give me 3 very specific examples of things that I had done while we were dating that were objectively cheap. And I'm not proud of this at all. I mean, I'm very embarrassed if I had any, it's not the kind of story that one would usually share, but it's important because it was a really valuable lesson I learned. And as she was giving me all these examples, I remembered the scenarios. I remembered the nights that we were out, but I didn't remember doing the things that she had said that I had done, which were objectively classless. I mean, I was basically a big cheap jerk. And I was just totally struck by it because I knew she obviously wasn't doing it to hurt my feelings. She was telling this because she thought it was going to help. And then she ended the conversation in an interesting way. She said, "I broke up with you because," she said, "you were the 3rd guy in a row I had dated who had an issue with money." And she said, "I didn't want to go there again." And she, along the lines of, we were talking about lessons that the universe keeps throwing at you. That was one that they were throwing at her. And she said, "And I don't believe that people can change." Now, I have a different perspective on that. I do believe people can change. And am here to tell you, I changed in an instant. I had read books on abundance, but I had not, lived them. I hadn't implemented them in any meaningful way. So I got those books out and I literally started implementing them and realized the importance, for example, of being grateful in advance for things, for being grateful for the abundance coming into my life when it wasn't necessarily there yet. The idea that if you want to be generous, you don't wait until you win the lottery to be generous, because there's no, there's no real point. I mean, yeah, you can help people, but if you want to experience yourself as being generous, you need to do it when it doesn't necessarily feel good to do that, where you're actually maybe sacrificing something in that moment. And so I started doing that. Even though I had a mountain of debt that I was working my way through, I started being more generous, and I started, catching myself and not doing the behaviors that she had identified that were legitimately cheap. And I also went back to, I thought about other people who would have seen these behaviors. She was not the only one. She was just the only one who had the courage to call me on it. And so I started thinking about other friends, and like I called my friend Sherry as an example. I called her up and we talked, and I said, I got to apologize for the way that I've been. And, and I told her, what Amber had called to my attention. And Sherry was very charming. She just looked at me and laughed. She said, "Oh, just figured you had, we're going through a tight time with money." She's like, "I didn't make it mean anything." But it was clear that she had noticed it. And so had a lot of other people, but they didn't, all these other people hadn't had the courage to give me the gift of that feedback. And feedback is in fact a gift. So it's a two-way street. On the one hand, you got to be open to it. But on the other hand, you have to be willing at times to be that angel for somebody else and to share with them the things, ask yourself the question. If you were the one who were doing this thing, would you want to know? Because we all have a blind spot, and this was my blind spot. And so, that was the key thing that I learned from that whole thing was that I had this blind spot around money and a scarcity mentality. Scarcity mentality is when you don't believe there's enough of something. The big 3 are time, money, and love. And for me, the scarcity was around money. There wasn't enough money. And if you believe there's not enough money, the universe will deliver that to your door. And you will continue to experience more of that. But if you believe that it's an abundant world and you live like that, and you share, what you have willingly, you will get more. And so, when I look at the people in my life who are the biggest angels, Amber is absolutely at the top of that list. And the financial abundance that I have experienced and that I continue to experience is a direct result of the fact that she shined a light on a big blind spot for me and helped me learn and grow from that. And so, the thing that I would encourage people, just as a last thing to think about, is what are the blind spots that you have, and who can help you overcome that, and how can you help the people that you know and love. What blind spots do they have that you could make a huge difference, and you could be their angel by shining a light on that in a loving, compassionate way. Amber didn't do that to make me feel bad. She did it because she legitimately thought she would could help me. And I have to give my credit to my older sister on that one, because it was a conversation that she and Amber had at the gym. I think they were on elliptical side by side when Amber had shared, some of her frustration with me. And my sister, I think, was the one who first encouraged her and said, have you talked to him about that? Have you shared that? And so, my sister clearly got, the value of somebody sharing that with me, and that observation, because it was super powerful, and it remains one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given.
Right, I agree. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and we would love to have you back on and keep going further on this, because I feel like there's so much more to cover that we've kind of just hit the top of the iceberg, so to speak.
I'd love to come. Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, and so thank you to everyone who's going to be watching this at the time, and if anyone's leaving comments or questions in the chat room during the live episode, thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who's going to watch this episode. And so in my normal format, so I will end the show with, wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or if you're asleep, feel free to wake up and tune into this episode. I feel confident you won't regret it. But with that being said, make each day filled with love and joy. And as Rob pointed out, be open to the feedback of people around you. Don't always assume it's going to be negative. It could be very positive, and it could be, like I've said on a couple of shows, that helping hand when you're feeling down that lifts you up. And so be open and don't dread what's coming. Be open to it and know it's coming from a place of love. And with that, I'm going to say goodnight to everyone. So good night.